Okay, welcome to our focus on writing in our methods class. So just like we did with reading, what I'm going to do with writing and with this first lecture, with this week's lecture, I'm going to kind of give you the big picture as I see it. And I really do think in terms of historical kind of ways of thinking, and so I'm going to pull it together that way. So I called this lecture Gina's History of Key Concepts in Writing Instruction. And of course, my focus always, even though a lot of what we're going to talk about here impacted all students, my focus is always English language learners and how we can support them. So let's take a quick look at some of the terms we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about writing process, traits, fluency, grammar, transformative power, apprenticing, and online asynchronous communication writing. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you a story. And my story ends at 1945. So really, the story I'm telling takes place before that. And this is a story of the universities in the United States. Up until 1945, they had a very different kind of student. For the most part, the students were male. Not all of them, of course, but most were male. And most of them were from families that were highly educated themselves. So their parents, or at least their father, had gone to college, and their grandfather, possibly their grandparents, but at least grandfather. And so there was a long line of education that brought those students there. And they weren't there usually to learn a trade. There were some learning to be doctors, some learning to be lawyers, etc. But really, often they were really just going to follow in their family business footsteps. And so what was education for? What were universities for? They were really to kind of put a finishing cultural kind of touch on the students themselves, so that when they left university and they were out in the world that they were joining, that they always recognized references to different pieces of literature, etc., that they were able to follow along with that. So was my family at university at that time? Absolutely not. We were just making it to 8th grade by that point. And so it's the next generation that would begin to graduate from high school. And it was the following generation that would then go on to university. So up until this time, writing at universities was simply an assessment tool. So if you were taking a class in ancient history, all of your exams would be essay exams in the class. All of the assessments for outside of class would be papers that you would write. Paper was a vehicle to assess students. And what would students get when they got that paper back? Often just a grade, just a numerical grade. So writing, for the most part, was not taught. Why? In some ways, because it didn't have to be. So those students sitting in those classes in university, they had been exposed to years and years of reading the same texts that they were then being exposed to in university. They had been exposed to the kind of educated talk, the kind of ways that people talk about these concepts and about these writers. So they'd already been exposed to that. And they'd absorbed it, and they brought it with them. And so, for the most part, instructors didn't say a thing about writing. Now, I was curious. I thought, okay, what about our university? What about, at that time, it would have been Cheney Normal School, right? And normal school means it was a place where high school graduates could learn to be teachers, and they would graduate with, in general, a 2-year degree, and they would move on and become a teacher. So was writing taught here? Well, I can guess that it was, because for normal schools in rural areas in which students, their education up until they graduated high school was not that strong, normal schools had to fill in the gaps. They needed to make sure that students were ready to model and critique and to teach writing. And so would Cheney Normal School have offered writing classes? Yes, but only to those students who didn't have access to the high school writing education that they probably needed, okay? So writing was not taught at all. Things changed after 1945. Why? Well, you can guess, because veterans, GIs returned from the war, and they returned as veterans who had rights to a university education. And many, many people took advantage of this benefit. And they were from all walks of life. They were from poor rural families like mine, and they were from middle-class families that maybe still had never had access to university education before. So now you've got all of these people registering for a university, and they haven't been exposed to those ways of talking, and they haven't been exposed to all of this reading that was expected. And they showed up ready for their classes and ready to be assessed on what they learned, and it didn't work. They couldn't express what they had learned in the ways that the instructors expected them to. And there was chaos. And often, chaos leads to wonderful developments. And what this led to is it led to a focus on process, a realization, wait a minute, those processes that our students used to arrive just knowing, we actually need to teach them in some way at the university. And so, voila, composition courses were created for universities. And at this time, people who were chosen to begin teaching composition courses, all of a sudden they realized, we don't know what we're doing. We need a way to come together. We need a way to learn about what it is that we should be doing. And so, voila, a new conference was created. It was called the Conference of College Composition and Communication, CCCC. And so this was created right after World War II. Now, I want to say something because I really like history, and so I don't want to discount a part of it. I'm simplifying the story just a little bit because during the Depression, so starting around 1930, 1931, students who would normally have not gone to university began to register for university, probably because there were no jobs, probably because mom and dad said, you know what, we probably need to find a different way for you to make your way to a living. And so it's a little more complicated than I'm making it, but what we have is we have this focus on process and realizing we really need to pay attention to what are the steps that good writers take as they're writing an essay. So what did this lead to? A naming of the steps, pre-writing, writing the first draft, redrafting, writing the second draft, editing, writing the third draft, right? All of this. And leading to the post-writing reflection or discussion or conferencing with the instructor. And so you've got this naming of the steps. You've also got a naming of the parts of an essay, for example, the introduction, the body, the conclusion, and then starting to name the different ways that even the body works depending on the text pattern that you're using. Is it a compare-contrast essay, or is it cause and effect? The body is going to look different. And starting to name the different kinds of connectors that would be used. With cause and effect, You might use connectors like consequently, and with compare and contrast, you might use a connector like likewise, right? So all of a sudden, there's all this focus on process. It's very key. And that's a lot of what your week, this week, will be focused on. Because one of the things that you will see for you to take a look at in our module is what I've created for you. Just like I took the scaffolded reading experiences list of pre-reading, during reading, post-reading, I created something similar for you. It's a long list. You know me, I have lots of ideas. I'm very talkative. It's a long list of things you could do with pre-writing to support students. And then what the different steps can look like as you, and ways that you can support that for students. Activities that you could suggest that they do while they're writing that first draft, or ways you could support them with that. Activities you could do in between drafts, that kind of thing. So some key terms that will come up on that sheet: editing and revising. And it's really important that you have a firm grasp on the difference between the two. So revising is a term that tends to happen especially often, or early rather, in the process. After students have written their first draft, we often see them revising. And revising is focused on the ideas. It's focused on connecting ideas and bringing in support, maybe bringing in some personal anecdotes to bring it alive, that kind of thing. So that's revising. Basically, an easy way to understand it is focused on ideas mostly. And then there's editing. And editing is focused mostly on that grammatical competence, word choice, correct grammar, punctuation. If students, for their writing, they're high enough level that they have to cite, they have to use citations, making sure that the mechanics of the citation is correct, that kind of thing. And so all of that focus on process, really, I want you to know, is firmly grounded in what happened at universities when the veterans began to enroll in university classrooms. Okay, so we've got that piece, and you're going to be exposed to lots of kind of ideas around the writing process and even some videos as well. Okay, so another concept that is really directly connected to this idea of process is the idea of writing traits. Now, process was really kind of born in about 1945. Traits come much later, and writing traits come from K through 12. And this is a movement to try to support students in a lot of different ways. One way is to, instead of having them focus on everything at once with writing an essay or a paragraph or whatever it is they're writing, to focus on one thing. And this can be really kind of emotionally unburdening for students. So even though there's lots and lots of things they can pay attention to, they can pay attention to ideas and letting their personal voice come through, mechanics, word choice, fluency, making sure that they don't put the reader asleep because every sentence is a simple sentence of exactly 6 words, so it ends up kind of rhythmically putting the reader to sleep. They can focus on so much. They can focus on organization of ideas. But if they focus on everything at once, you might lose them. And so writing traits, and you can find it easily. Originally it was called 6 writing traits, and then it was called 6+1 writing traits. But you can easily find information about it online, and again, it comes out of K through 12. It also really focuses on giving teachers a way to grab onto these 6 or these 7 ways to talk about writing with students. So you could say, okay, everyone, we're going to start an essay today, and there's lots of things we can focus on, but today I want us to talk about voice. I want us to talk about how you can let your ideas come out on the page so I can actually hear your voice as I'm reading your work. So it gives us a way to kind of tackle that as teachers. And along the way, Traits has been developed to have strategies tied on to that specific strategy, strategic competence of how to support students as they're working with organization, how to support students as they are developing their voice, or they're starting to realize that there's a lot of options around word choice, and making just the right one can be very key. So focusing on traits, even though it came out of K through 12, no matter where you're headed to teach, this is a useful idea. Instead of focusing on everything today, let's focus on this. And you can even focus on just one thing for an entire piece of writing. That often happens in K through 12. Okay, let's move on to the term fluency. Okay? Now, we know that universities were shaken up on or about 1945, but they were also shaken up in the early 50s for a very different reason. And that was because suddenly, for the first time ever, U.S. universities really began to get international students. So international students were hearing about universities in the U.S., they had a good reputation, and they began to come to the U.S. Visas were open, there were ways for them to come, and they came. First one, University of Michigan, Ann Arbor was the first university to really begin to get a population of international students. Now, what the instructors realized, those instructors who had experienced the inclusion of veterans, of a very different population of students, including, one thing I haven't stated, but you've probably picked up on it already, we're talking about breaking up who university students are in terms of SES, socioeconomic status. Before 1945, it certainly didn't include families like mine. After 1945, it did start to include families like mine, because my family, very poor, and we certainly couldn't have afforded university. And so, so these instructors had experienced that change. They'd formed a conference to come together and to talk about how they could support students. But with international students, suddenly they had two new pieces on their hands that they needed some support with: fluency and grammar. And I'm simplifying a little bit. There's another piece too we'll talk about in the 488 class in the spring, supporting second language literacy. We'll be talking about actually rhetorical patterns and the rhetorical patterns that students came with that didn't match up with what the instructors expected. But today, around the skill of writing, we're just going to talk about fluency and grammar. So these students that arrived, the international students, often they had an amazing vocabulary and they had studied so much English, but when they took an essay exam, even though they knew the material, they even knew the language that they needed to express the material, they could barely write a paragraph in, say, a 2-hour essay time. And so there was this realization, there's something more going on with international students. We need to support them in a different way. And so a new development was this focus on fluency. Not just the mechanics, the grammatical, getting the grammar right with accuracy, but being able to, when you put your pen to paper, begin writing and keep writing, no matter what. Even if you're just writing, I don't know what to write, I don't know what to write, I don't know what to write. But really being able to take what you want to say and express it in a very quick and almost automatic way, that's fluency. And that's what the international students, for the most part, didn't have when they were arriving. So at the university level originally, but then also at the K-12 level as well, we started to focus on ways that we could support students with developing this almost automaticity. What does it look like? It often looks like when students come in, there's a prompt on the board, and this could be adult students at a university preparing to enter the university. It could be third graders, it could be 12th graders, whatever level. Students come in, they see a prompt, they take out a piece of paper, they begin writing, and they are not supposed to stop their pen until the time is up. It can look like that. It can look like repetition writing. It can look like, okay everyone, I want you to write as much as you can about what you did last night. And so students begin writing, time is up, and then the teacher says, okay, I want you to do it again, but I want you to tell me even more. So now students are saying the same thing, going faster, and then adding some more ideas. So that's an example of fluency work. And that is how it entered our repertoire of strategies that we need with our English language learners. Grammar also was a big issue. Of course, with the international students, these instructors who weathered that change to teaching process, suddenly they realized that international students were coming needing to know grammar rules, needing reinforcement, needing to be talked about errors that they were making methodically, and they needed to pay some attention to. And so at this point, a lot of attention began to be paid to grammar. So much focus that at a lot of intensive English programs, so for adult students who are high school graduates trying to enter a university, grammar was made its own class. And it wasn't until later that it actually began to be, at a lot of places, connected with the writing class itself. But it was given so much kind of emphasis that it got its own class. So one question that you either are already asking yourself or have asked yourself in the past is, how do you know how to teach grammar to students? In other words, if you're headed off to teach kindergartners and they're beginners, how do you teach grammar to them? And how is that different than if maybe in the afternoons you're working in an adult education program and you've actually got the parents of those kindergartners? How much do you say to them about grammar? Well, there's a couple of terms that we need to talk about first. One is explicit grammar instruction, and the other is implicit grammar instruction. So let's talk a little bit about it. So implicit means you don't say it directly, or if you do say it directly, it's not until the very end. So implicit grammar instruction might look like if you want your students, or you feel your students are ready, or you need your students to begin adding ed for past tense, you could read them a lot of stories that have the past tense ending. You could then ask them to retell the story, and they, with luck, might be exposed to hearing some of their fellow classmates, so there'd be some noticing moments where they're able to notice their classmates using that. You might do some songs and chants with your students in which everybody in a choral way is using the past tense, and then maybe have them write their own chant and carry it out for the class. And again, maybe with luck, they're noticing their classmates using that past tense ending. That is implicit grammar instruction. So maybe at the very end you say, hey, look what we did today. Look what we did this week. We used the past tense. We referred to the past, and look at that. We add, when you read it, it's ed. When we say it, it's either duh, tuh, or id. Makes 3 different sounds. Isn't that interesting? That could still, even if you're naming it, if you name it at the very end, that's implicit grammar instruction, at least in my book. So what's explicit grammar instruction? Explicit grammar instruction is when you name it and you tell how the rule works, you give examples, and then often you have students doing something. So with explicit grammar instruction, you might, for example, with past tense, your students come in and you have up on the board some words with past tense, and you ask the students, what do all of these words have in common? Someone might say they're all verbs. Someone else, maybe who's a little more advanced, might say they all mean yesterday, right? And then you pull that out. What do you mean they all mean yesterday? Ah, they refer to the past, yes. And how do they do that? And you circle those ed endings, right? And so then what would you do is you'd probably give some sample sentences that have the verb in the past tense. And you might have students do something with that. With a partner, find the past tense words. Or write 3 more sentences themselves with a partner that also use the past tense, that kind of thing. So that is explicit grammar instruction. So once again, if you don't name the rule, or you name it at the very end after they've been exposed to it in a myriad ways, that's implicit. Explicit, you start with a rule, and then you might get to the interesting examples, but you start with the rule, and you explicitly lecture about that. So one thing I wondered when I was in your shoes is, okay, how do I know which one to choose for my students? Cels Murcia, a researcher in our area and a teacher educator, she did some research long ago, I think it was in the late 90s, looking at what's the optimal way to approach grammar. And what she found were there were 3 factors that we really need to take into consideration when we are deciding how to tackle grammar with our students. Think about the age of the learner. Think about the educational level. How much education, formal education I mean, how much education have they had? And what are their goals? Okay? So what I mean by this is, if you have young learners, and young learners from 0 to 3rd grade, if you have young learners, you probably need to turn to implicit grammar instruction. If you have older learners, you probably want to turn to explicit grammar instruction, and I'll say something about that in just a moment. That may be kind of that you can hear in my voice. Look at the educational level. The less formal education a student has, the more you should rely on implicit grammar instruction. The more formal education they already have, the more explicit. So back to our kind of flustered university professors who are trying to figure out how to teach grammar to their international students. Those students, they were older than 3rd grade. They had a lot of educational level, a lot of formal education, and so we can see they should turn to explicit grammar instruction. It works for them, and the students are probably expecting it. There's one more level. What are the goals of the student? The more professional the goals are, the more you need to use explicit grammar instruction in your teaching. And if students are learning from you just so they have the language that they need to talk with their landlord, or talk with the person who lives next to them, or talk with their kids' teachers, that's non-professional, and you could rely on implicit grammar instruction for that. Now back to the adults that I mentioned. In general, older adults, you would, meaning older than 3rd grade and up, 4th grade and up, you would use more explicit grammar instruction. But if you've got adults who have very little, if any, formal education, this education level trumps that. And so you would actually use implicit grammar instruction with them. Okay. So we've talked about process, where that came from. We've talked about how traits, the idea of traits, entered into our repertoire and what it can mean for you as an instructor. And we've talked about fluency in grammar, how with international students at universities, that kind of really entered a new level of our teaching consciousness and really got us thinking about the roles that those need to take. Let's talk for a moment about the transformative power of writing. Another element that I think is key for you, no matter what level you are teaching, is to recognize that there's been a lot of work, both kind of formal, research-based, published studies, but also just teacher research in their own classrooms and watching light bulbs go on and watching students get engaged. That for everyone, but maybe especially for English language learners, writing has an amazing ability to help students connect with what they're learning, to help them engage with it, and to help them express ideas that they might not be able to otherwise. And just to throw this out here as well, at times, especially right now in K through 12, we receive refugees in our K through 12 system who have had horrendous experiences. That's happening right now in Spokane Public Schools. And writing can be a way that students are able to express those things that they bring with them to school. It can be a way for them to express what they've seen and experienced and the losses that they've had and how they are experiencing a transition from the world that they knew to this new world that may not be so inviting to them. So this is a really key piece, and this is going to show up too. I've got a couple of short readings for you to take a look at, one on the transformative power of writing to the president, but just to kind of get you thinking about the authentic ways that you can have students writing about their own experiences, or that you can have them taking what they think, what they believe, what they know, and expressing that through writing, whether it's through a letter to the president, or whether it's in writing a heartfelt poem, whatever it is. So be thinking about that, not just as something your students need to master, but how it can actually set them free. So be thinking about that in your teaching. Another thing that I want to talk about very briefly, and this comes out of research that was done by Douglas Bieber and Pat Bird, in my mind, this is how I anchor it, is the idea of apprenticing. So when we go back to before 1945, when people were writing, they were simply writing to express what they had learned. They were writing to convey meaning. And if anything, they were just kind of using a generic academic writing style. And when the students changed at universities and suddenly you had veterans in universities, they weren't there to be culturally refined. They weren't there so that they could carry off a better cocktail hour discussion. They were there so they could get ready for a profession. And so really, after 1945, we had this idea that we should be apprenticing. We should be learning, not just learning science, but learning to talk like scientists. And for our purposes today, learning to write like scientists. And so this idea, it was really kind of, I think, born after 1945, but I really think it came into being in the 1990s, and you saw it impact K through 12 in wonderful ways, getting students to listen to how scientists talk, and to talk that way when they give their presentations, to look at the ways that science is written. How do scientists write? And then for that to show up in their writing as well. And this is a wonderful help for our English language learners, whether you're headed to K through 12 and you'll find that kind of environment there, or whether you are, like you should, applying it for your adult students or overseas, wherever. Put in front of students the kinds of texts that you want them to be able to write like. And we should be paying close attention to how, whatever the kind of writing it is that we're putting in front of students, whether it's compare-contrast essay, whether it is a sociology reading and we want them to write a sociology essay, whatever it is, we should be paying close attention to how that language works. And I mentioned Douglas Bieber and Patricia Bird, and I want to highlight them just for a moment. If you are taking the 496 class, also known as 471, I've already talked to you about Douglas Bieber and Patricia Bird, but to highlight here, when we developed the technology to develop concordancers, so we could put large amounts of text, everything Shakespeare had written, every article that's ever come out of the New York Times, for example, when we had the ability to put all that data into computers, we also got the tool of the concordancer, which can search those large pieces of data. And with that, we came the ability to start to notice from the 10,000-foot view how writing works, how a compare-contrast essay works across thousands of compare-contrast essays, how the language of science works, looking across thousands of texts written by scientists, for example. And all of this work, Douglas Bieber led it, and then Patricia Bird kind of followed up and really brought it to us in TESOL in a way that we could really apply. All of this is getting us to pay attention to our students as apprentices. Okay. Let's see. Hold on. Almost done. Last thing I want to mention before we go. Hold on a second. Last thing I want to mention before we go is one thing that I have seen change drastically over my time teaching is the impact of online writing and the impact of asynchronous writing. So online writing could refer to at the same time you're chatting, right? You're having a discussion by chat, or online can mean asynchronous, where the kind of writing that you and I are doing on this in this class, where you send something maybe a minute or an hour or a day later, I read it, I respond, so that's asynchronous, not at the same time. So right before I got my first full-time job, I was taught how to use online writing with students. So that was the first time that someone exposed me to that. And over my career, I have seen that just take off. And I wanted to hit a couple of highlights for you. One thing is that a lot of research over time has found that English language learners do very well with asynchronous online discussion. And one reason that has come out through the research is that they have time to reflect. They have time to think rather than responding automatically in class. And another thing that I've witnessed that, and I've also witnessed students who are extremely shy and who don't say very much in class. Maybe they don't even write very much when we do writing in class. If it's asynchronous, they are very likely to produce a lot more. And so I really think that this has been a key kind of concept that we're still thinking through. There's a lot of journals that look at this around English language learners and how to support them and what's going on. If that interests you, reach out to me. I actually did my doctorate in that. But, and I can kind of share with you some places you can go to not only learn about what we know so far, but to make sure that you're really tapped into the key pieces. But one thing to think about with whatever kind of teaching you're doing, whether it's overseas or it's here, whether it's adults, whether it's children, is to think about whether or not you might want to include some kind of online component, especially some kind of asynchronous online component in your teaching. Okay. All right, so where do you go from here? You've got a lot of reading to take a look at, and I'm very hopeful that you'll find it too very much connects with many of the pieces that I've shared here, this kind of big picture, and then also some videos as well to take a look at, to view, and see some of this in action. See teachers teaching the process, see teachers carrying out different types of teaching of genre, that kind of thing. Okay, good luck, and I'll see you in the discussion.